Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on winning with use cases. I'm Julie Gallagher, Senior Managing Editor at Supermarket News, and I'll be the moderator. We're excited to have you join us for the third webinar in this best practice series. Before we get started, let me point out a few quick tips on how to make the most of today's webinar. If you're experiencing technical difficulty, let us know through the Q&A box or by troubleshooting through the Help widget. Some common problems, such as the loss of sound and/or a stall in the slides, may be resolved by a quick refresh of your browser. Please make sure to turn off any content blockers so you can utilize all the widgets on the console. If you have a question for one of the speakers, you can submit it via the Q&A box. We will try to address all questions during the panel discussion, and for any attendee questions that we don't get to, we'll email you the answer upon conclusion of the webinar. Today's slides will be sent to all webinar attendees as part of a thank you email. Don't forget to share today's webinar by clicking the Twitter or LinkedIn buttons at the bottom of your screen. You can also tweet during or after the webinar. There's a Twitter widget on the left-hand side of the console. We're using hashtag retailer collaboration for today's event and hope you will too. At Supermarket News, we regularly report on the hurdles retailers face in areas ranging from out of stocks to product assortment decisions. Retailers encounter heightened pressure from the investor community to improve financial results. Most retailers recognize the importance of collecting and making use of data, but many struggle to identify the best opportunities. That is the focus of today's webinar. All of this ties into the concept introduced in the first two webinars in this series, which were titled The Next Generation of Data Sharing and Alerting in Action, Solving Business Problems and Recapturing Sales. With that context, here are some of the key areas we'll focus on today. How to apply actionable data to retailers' most pressing problems, how to use daily downstream data to set goals and create collaborative business processes, how to ensure you're using the right tools to get the most out of your data. Today's presenters are well qualified to address this important issue. First, you'll hear from Jason Whitmer, President of Market Research at Cleveland Research. Then we'll have a presentation from the RSI team. Joining us today from RSI is Jennifer Beasley, General Manager of the Retail Team, and Murtuza Habibullah, the Senior Director, Retail Channels. After that, we'll have a panel discussion on key topics related to this issue and give you an opportunity to ask questions. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Jason Whitmer.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me again on this webinar. I'm going to spend a couple minutes setting up a few themes around key business drivers, particularly from a financial standpoint, talk through some material paradigm shifts within retail, specifically isolate onto some inventory issues that we're seeing across some big box retailers, and address that under this umbrella of points of pain, and then finish with some actionable ideas before turning it back to Jennifer. Within the framework right now of what we would be most focused on if we were a retailer, and even if most investors that look at their investments in retailers will be looking at 6 key broader issues that they would like to see all moving in the right direction. Certainly, I think a lot of retailers would as well, to see not only a good growing category and a channel, but also a niche that is serving some opportunities that may not be filled completely or saturated, and so be able to grow, both grow into the channel and grow share within that channel, and do that organically relative to a peer set would be your 2 best top-line drivers. Sometimes just square footage growth and opening new stores has historically been the path of growth, but to do that profitably, there's still some opportunities to do that today, but the underscore on that bullet, that would be on profitable new square footage growth, not just opening stores to open stores. The fourth on this list is improving your product mix, so basically improving your margin opportunity either through lower cost of goods or through product category mix shifts. Sometimes supply chain opportunities can fit into this as well. And then, but also be more effective with promotions, and not just renting sales or buying sales at the expense of margin, so it becomes a net wash, but to do things where you drive the top line on making it a more balanced flow-through within the P&L statement. And then lastly, to be able to either leverage those sales or to measure, maintain cost control through your fixed expenses or even some of the variable expenses around labor and healthcare and the like. But those would be the most important financial engines. But when you start thinking about the current retail environment or the bigger picture paradigm shift as we've really seen over the last number of years, and not just with the cyclical downturn that we've gone through, but really it's a new world and a new world view for retail. We just don't see nearly as many growth opportunities across the marketplace, especially in more traditional channels, whether they be big box retailers or even some of the niche retailers or category killers as they've been called in the past. And so those growth opportunities are a little bit harder to find. You have to get real niche focused or specialize in many pockets. But in reality, the top line opportunities today are really coming at the expense of somebody else. So gaining share is pivotal not only for retailers but even suppliers in many cases, and getting their fair share of the shelf or a disproportionate share of the shelf. And often both of those come at a high cost, and it's created an ultra-competitive environment where everybody seems to be biting at each other for the same, basically a pie that's not growing. With that being said, the broader retail marketplace does feel saturated, whether that's on the retail front or even on the restaurant side of things, where we've just been overbuilding for a long time, probably faster than the rate of demand, either as measured in foot traffic or even in purchasing power, and that's created a more competitive marketplace. But we've also seen then those promotions that have been applied just have not been working as well, either as well as in past or as well as expected, or even if it's creative and you find something that is working, very quickly somebody else will copycat that and dilute it and create more noise in the marketplace. And when you think about the cost umbrella, as we talked about previously, a lot of retailers have been already pulling that trigger for a number of years, and in many cases have cut to the bone. There's not a lot left to cut, and it's leading to either sales deleverage with weaker top line or even impacting the operations from a service standpoint. And so when we talk about some business issues or use cases that probably come out most visibly in our work across the retail environment, inventory is one that tends to be most focused on and quite a bit of tension, especially for retailers to manage. And suppliers get caught into this too, where obviously they would like as much inventory as possible out there. But the retailers often, if they have too much inventory, clearly that leads to fairly quick markdown risk or margin challenges if they don't sell through too much. We've seen many more retailers being willing to go down that path and miss the sales opportunities to avoid that margin risk. That's been fairly clear to us really for the last few years, whether it be the mass retailers or department stores, or like I said, more recently, even some of those category killers. But the challenge is when you start to get on your heels with inventory as a retailer, it's much more difficult to drive sales. With less stuff on the floor, it's harder to sell more stuff. And then very quickly, this leads to out of stocks, and then it starts this downward cycle. It becomes a spiral in many cases where softer sales then leads the retailers to cut into the labor, and then less labor then hurts the in-stocks, which then pressures sales, and then just leads to more inventory cuts. If retailers aren't careful, this can be a slippery slope and an endless cycle that just feeds itself. And some retailers are struggling tremendously within this, whether it's just a demand issue for someone like Sears, or those like even Target that's just trying to get out of the weeds and trying to drive the business where traffic is more on the positive slope and people are back into the stores. But one that talks about inventory management the most would be Walmart relative to their sales growth. Historically, the playbook for Walmart is to grow inventory half the rate of sales, and that's the best way for them to not only manage their expenses and the overall inventory carrying costs fairly well, but it still keeps them in an ability to refresh the shelves, reset the shelves, and still have product to sell. The problem is the last couple of years, their shelves haven't been quite as full as even Walmart would admit they would like to have them. And it's interesting more recently to hear them make more investments back into labor. It's very selective but fairly fresh and new that they are trying to attack this a little more straight on from an operations standpoint. But the lines here that we put in this chart just show how much in excess the same-store inventory has been exceeding the same-store sales. And that's a gap that you don't really want to see as a retailer. Ideally, you'd like them to be there'd be no gap at all, or if anything, to have your forward comp in excess of retail, where you're actually have the rhythm of driving sales, but at a good profitability. And so when you think about, particularly from a retail perspective, where your biggest points of pain may be, there's really 5 items we wanted to highlight here. One, the assortment across channels is really starting to blur in terms of what is unique and differentiated, whether it's the big box retailers adding food to drive traffic, or the food retailers adding general merchandise or HBA categories, or even some of the limited assortment retailers trying to get into fresh. And on it goes, and even e-commerce these days is blurring from an assortment standpoint. That becomes very difficult to manage, especially when you start thinking about inventory and the endless aisle, as a lot of retailers are trying to build omni-channel into their businesses. Second, the consumer these days is not just more fickle, but harder to understand, harder to reach, as much as the accessibility for consumers has gone up tremendously through mobile phones. The way they shop, where they shop, and even the brand loyalty within all of that, or retail loyalty, has really started to shift gears and made it much more difficult to predict or then to forecast and then to execute on retail strategies and for suppliers that come alongside. And therefore, that's the third bullet here, is then the ability to look forward has been much more challenged, where the assumed elasticity effects, either based upon historical or predicted, become somewhat difficult to manage. And then, therefore, retailers, fourth here, end up making fewer inventory bets. They lose a little bit of confidence, conviction, and really stepping forward into that and trying to drive sales. And when we see bigger inventory bets, often they don't pay off these days. And so that's been a more conservative management of the business. And then ultimately it leads to fifth here, a little bit less strategic or creative store-level opportunities, whether it be on the execution front or even enabling managers and associates to be retailers. And often these days we see a lot of these store-level associates just putting out fires, and that can become a challenge for not just the senior management to deploy, but then to train and to keep people engaged on a day-to-day basis across the business segments at the store level. So we wanted to leave a little bit of actionable ideas as we would consider it before turning it back to Jennifer, but 3 things we wanted to talk about. One, be crystal clear with both the vision as well as then your strategic objectives for driving sales, really in focusing only on what matters most and not wasting time in the weeds. And this is certainly for retailers first, and then secondly, to try to communicate that internally across the organization, but also then externally with suppliers. And so this is where to set goals that could be a win-win scenario with some reasonable targets and opportunities for everybody to be on the same page, rather than setting unrealistic objectives, either too difficult internally to reach, or have conflicts internally, or don't meet the same objectives that suppliers would have. Things end fairly quickly when any of these business issues start to show up, when everybody's not on the same page. But also then to have the same toolbox to leverage what's currently available, as well as some talent and resources, but also then create some standardization across both the entire retail organization as well as then the supplier community, which I'm sure we'll talk about here a little bit more in a couple minutes. And then lastly, to be able to take the data that is pulled out of these systems and tools, be able to connect the dots between not just the quantitative targets, but also the qualitative issues. Too often we're seeing issues come up, whether it be at the store level or within the management team, to say, hey, this doesn't make sense, but there's no ability to actually adjust on the fly, or to create some autonomy at the store level to be able to adjust inventory levels, or to say, hey, we really need to force the replenishment system to kind of correct itself, or actually this is phantom inventory, it doesn't really exist, but they don't have the capability to fix it, or if they do, often they're disincentivized to do that, considering it would impact their shrink numbers. So to make sure that everybody's on the same page across all layers, from senior management to middle management to store level to suppliers, and customers won't get confused, will see the product on the shelf and be driven to the point of purchase. Those are my prepared remarks. I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer to carry it on.
Thanks, Jason. I think that gives us some really good perspective from your part of the industry. And at RSI, our core expertise, or one of our core expertise, is helping retailers design collaborative data sharing programs. And those programs squarely target the growth challenge that you've just mentioned. And what strikes me as we've been developing these programs the last few years is that retailers are sharing data, but their data sharing programs are really designed backwards. And what I mean by that is they're sharing some forms of data. Suppliers are getting it and using it however they think is most appropriate within their own systems. But really, not all the data that they need is shared, and nobody's measuring the ROI. And on top of that, suppliers really make uneven use of it. So what we found is a much more effective way to identify improvement is to figure out, what do you want done with the data? Make sure you share supportive metrics, and then collaborate around it and measure those opportunities. So as a retailer, if you're still struggling, as most are, with inventory issues and forecasting and on-shelf availability, the question is, are your suppliers really working on your most strategic issues? And what can you do to get them to focus on them even more? As we've worked with more than 90 retailers, both here in the U.S. and abroad, what I've seen as the best-in-class solution here is where a retailer takes their top 2 or 3 goals for the year, and from a very executive level, they map out a plan that ties it down to day-to-day execution. The way that they do that is through use case collaboration, which we're going to focus on today. But they also filter in added value from things like, Jason, along the lines that we were talking about, making it actionable in store, applying digital services to the mix of supportive tools, and then measuring that benefit and that improvement through scorecarding, which they then incorporate into their joint business planning efforts, into their annual top-to-top. So this entire cycle is something that we see a lot of benefit being driven by best-in-class retailers. And before we get too far down this path, I'd really like to outline exactly what is a use case. Essentially, it's a defined problem or need that your organization has to solve. In the retail arena, some examples of that might be, let's say you want to improve your promotion distribution center to store inventory allocations, or waste reduction, or even inventory productivity, for example. The key is taking that need and creating a process, like a collaborative business process around it, that's really actionable. So if you choose a couple of use cases rather than many, so you're not trying to boil the ocean, and then genuinely collaborate with your suppliers around it, it makes a tremendous difference in your metric improvement. So the next thing is, well, how do you do that? We've identified a number of steps in a very detailed fashion that will help a retailer do that, a couple of which we've talked about, but the first is really to select a tool to standardize your work so that your team and your associates aren't trying to reinterpret different reports from different systems with different filters and metrics. It's a really important piece. And it sets guardrails so that your team and your associates are able to more effectively manage the business. I mentioned, identifying a couple of use cases to work on. Don't boil the ocean. And making sure that your feed has everything that you need to support those use cases that are most important to you. But the real work comes in the next few steps. If you work with a handful of your trusted partners, your closest business associates, and you pilot a data sharing program, you're going to get paid dividends from it. You're going to learn a lot about your business that you didn't know. It's also going to allow you to measure the performance of data sharing and to correct anything that need to be managed before you deploy out to other suppliers. It's also helpful to think about, we've got a broad range of suppliers as retailers. We've got some of the largest CPGs in the world on down to the mom and pops who are providing local goods and services. So you want to think about the spectrum of suppliers as you're developing these programs too. And then again, ultimately integrating insights and data into your day-to-day and monthly discussions with your partners and into the more executive level meetings that you have on an ongoing basis. Well, one of the key steps is setting up a data feed with the right metrics. And most folks are familiar that retailers have been sharing sales and inventory, but that's just not enough anymore. Where we see best-in-class retailers moving towards is they're sharing additional metrics that support advanced use cases, things like promotional calendars, reclaim, purchase order statistics. An example of why this is important is, let's say if a retailer wanted to reduce excess inventory, so back along the lines what Jason was saying, you don't want too much excess inventory, but you can't have too little and risk out of stocks. If we're going to try to eliminate excess inventory, it might be helpful to have a promotional calendar so that we can identify where there might be some product build in the system to support those features. And then ultimately, most retailers don't have extra IT projects slotted away for anything that comes up. IT resources are typically pretty valuable. So as you're designing a feed, you want to make sure that it's going to meet your objectives in terms of use cases for the next couple of years. Most retailers who are really serious about collaborating are sharing at minimum master data, store data, product flow, store flow, DC inventory, and also forecasts. So these are all important things to think about. In addition to the feed, we also need to think about the use cases that we want to focus on. Now, when I sit down and I talk to retailers about use cases, there are typically a handful that they invariably are most interested in. Out of our more than 70 that we've developed at RSI, I would say those are out of stock in various forms, inventory productivity, which really drives down into things like promotions and resets and unsaleables. And the good thing about templates is they're a fantastic starting point. So it gives you a means for being able to really manage the data that you can incorporate into your collaboration programs and tailor it specifically to your supplier and your needs. So just to give you an example of this, I recently worked with one retailer and set up a collaboration program with them, and they've selected these 4 use cases to focus on and to pilot for year 1. And these 4 use cases were really quite helpful. They hit all of these key areas that Jay's just mentioned. One is promotion forecast. An example of that is they're trying to analyze previous promotions and adjust for the lost sales that resulted from out of stocks the last time. Shelf void correction. You know, we all have been in a store and have seen an out of stock that really impacted our shopping. And so this is applying algorithms to detect where there might be shelf issues like phantom inventory or out of stocks. And then inventory management. I mean, this is the holy grail, and there's a lot of different ways we can look at inventory management. But this particular retailer opted to track weeks of supply versus the goals that they had set for some specific brands and products. And then last but not least, they selected display optimization so that they would build display configurations and recommend the optimal allocations to store so they wouldn't have too much or too little impacting the floor. So Martuza, if you could please walk us through some of these use cases in a very detailed way so everybody can get a sense of exactly what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And diving into some of the details here, so let's take one of the use cases, which is promotion forecast and allocation, which Jennifer mentioned. if you break that down in terms of the process, and especially where the collaboration happens, it starts with the retailer providing rich data, in this case a promotion calendar, which is forward-looking, and also providing guardrails and focus areas on which promotions that they really want to do this process at. The vendor then takes this information, the tools that are available through the RSI system, and generates the forecast. And this generated forecast is down to the store item level, leveraging a large amount of history, including not just past sales, but also where the past out-of-stocks were, so it can be factored into potential future promotion allocations. The next step is then the vendors get together with the retailers and they discuss adjustments and take action. Think about adjustments as this time we think the promotion is going to behave slightly differently because the display mode was slightly different, or there were media ads that will drive consumer behavior slightly differently, in which case they can adjust it upwards or downwards. And then the action can be taken in different ways. One of the actions that we've seen retailers successfully do is pushing product out from the DCs to only the stores that need incremental quantities for that promotion week. Or in other systems where we can go in and plug in a perpetual inventory or promotion index change into a CGO system that helps plan for better promotion allocations. Either way, after this process is done and the promotion is completed, what we also close the loop with in each of these collaborative business processes is the ROI measurement. So things like, what was the forecast accuracy? How did that affect or reduce excess inventory past promotions compared to historic events? Did we prevent lost sales during the promoted week, or what was the incremental sales driven by better allocation? So if you were to look at that now in some more details of what it looks like in the system, in the RSI system, for example, here's a screenshot of what a template could look like. And this is just one example out of the many that are built out of the box and available to the retailer partners as well as the vendors as they go on board. We start with a bunch of instructions, so every template is very clear on what the steps needed to be taken are. These steps and instructions are usually defined collaboratively with the retailer, so all the suppliers using the system are on the same platform, which makes it a lot easier to look at results as well as look at ROI and be on the same level playing field. First step is, then the next step is to look at the historic events. If you can see the table here, it's a little fuzzy, but you see there's historic weeks. So for each week, we have the total sales dollars and the promoted price. And what's not shown here is the price elasticity chart, which allows the vendors to visualize how that particular item or group of items behave at different price points. Effectively, what is their elasticity? If we drop the price, how much does the volume go up? Leveraging this historic data, which is really granular by store and item, then selecting weeks on the right side of the chart where you can pick historic weeks that are comparable. By doing that, what the system automatically does is on the next tab will give you the specific promotion week, forward-looking promotion week. It'll give us the promotion forecast, the overall promotion level, down to the divisions, and also down to the store item after factoring in a ton of specific retailer attributes. For example, it could be stores that shouldn't be receiving any promotion products, stores that are discontinued or about to close down. So we apply a whole bunch of filters and additional information so the vendor community and the retailers do not have to do this on a case-by-case basis. What happens next is after we've run the established templates that we just looked at, and the retailers, retailer buy-in, the planners sit down and have that discussion adjustments, action is taken. And this action, when it's get executed at the store, usually drives increase in sales, reduced out of stocks. And this has been, as what Jennifer was saying, this is one of the key use cases that we've heard across a bunch of retailers that we work with as one of the primary use cases they're interested in. And also when we measure the return on investment, it has proven to be one of the best in terms of value creation. Taking a slightly different look now at a different use case, which is rundown management or rundown analysis. A rundown analysis is when a UPC is either being discontinued as part of overall discontinuation of a product line, or it's being rolled over to a new UPC. If you break down the item or the category-specific timeline, the process starts, and if you look at the steps from left to right, the process starts with that decision to discontinue the item. It's made by the brand, the customer, along with the retailer partners. Once you've determined the date for the exit, we input that information into our system, and leveraging that and other information that already resides in the RSI system based on the data feed, we prepare our RI, which is a retail intelligence solution for retail solutions. And what then leads us to step 4 and 5, which happen in parallel, is to do two things. One is to identify where is the excess inventory at the DCs. So what do we do about that? And the second step is to also look at the store level to understand which stores are either on one extreme a reclaim risk, which means there's excess inventory that will not sell through before the item is discontinued. On the other hand, is a shortage risk because the DCs have stopped replenishing the stores and the stores don't have enough. Collaboratively, with the vendors and the retailers, come up with a proposed action plan. It could be multiple different things that can be in the action plan, which would then initiate the action. And the next step, of course, to initiate the action plan. The action plan could be ranging anywhere from temporary price reduction, which is typically done at the overall chain level, but having granular data and analytics that support further slicing of the data. We've seen very successful implementations where TPRs were done by division or even down to the store level, thus saving a bunch of trade funds that can be potentially used for future promotions. Manufacturing coupons are other approaches that can be used. As these action plans are put into place and as we pass the item exit date marked with the star, like with each of our out-of-the-box collaborative business processes, there is an analyzing step to analyze what happened, what was the results. So we identify the results through templates, whether it's in the system or external RSI Excel templates, to identify what was the benefit of taking this action. At the end of the day, we want to make sure not only that the work put into this was needed, but also what the outcome was helped both the vendor as well as the manufacturers. If you look at the next step, shows exactly what that report could look like. In this case, we have a list of 4 UPCs which have been masked. This is real data, just been masked. We've seen, you have item exit dates for each. We've got store on hand, so we know what the store on hand is. We know how many days to exit, but we also know what the velocity has been for the selling of these items. Leveraging this information, the report generates exceptions. We do not necessarily want to see all UPCs. We want to see UPCs where we need to take some action. The first 2 UPCs represent a reclaim risk where we're not going to sell through the inventory. It identifies in red what that reclaim risk is to the vendors, but also identifies in green if we were to take any action, what would be the improved, what would be the benefit to the retailer on essentially doing TPRs and reducing price and selling through these, and also what's the margin benefit. The 2 UPCs at the bottom are the opposite spectrum, where there is not enough product. They're great selling products at those stores. However, the item's being discontinued, and if the DC does not replenish the stores with products through the discontinuation period, they're going to run out of stock. So there's a bunch of key benefits here for the manufacturer, the retailer, and in terms of mutual avoiding inefficiencies of having product being sent from a retailer store to a reclaim facility and then having to go through a deductions process. If you look at the next slide, and this hits on a lot of what Jason as well as Jennifer talked about earlier, is that these examples of our collaborative business processes, and you'll automatically see there's themes here. There's multiple retailers, going through each of them. If you look at them at a high level, there's the out-of-stock piece and the out-of-stock situations that are resolved in the stores. Identification of the out-of-stock can be done in different ways, but the resolution are either done through forcing out product from the DCs to the stores, or in some cases, the stores themselves taking action alerts. Just talked about promotion allocation. That's a big use case that you see occurring in multiple retailers here on the screen. And also new items and inventory productivity are ones that a lot of retailers will collaborate with the vendor partners, build these collaborative business processes for not just not just for a one-time ROI, but a sustained and a high return on investment for everybody. In any pilot, from when the retailer goes from testing out a solution, to Jennifer's point earlier about picking fewer use cases, picking a fewer set of suppliers to test things out with, it's always important to do a value documentation, also get a projection of what could this program really mean for us. In this example, this is just a framework of an example of how it can be done. The first row talks about over 6 weeks for 3 suppliers, what were the incremental sales, reduction in inventory, and then extending that out for the remainder of the year is the center part, and looks at different use cases as well. For example, promotion forecast, display optimization, shelf void correction, collaborative inventory management, based on real results. These are not hypothetical case studies. These are real results, leveraging real data from the retailer, in this case 3 suppliers, over possibly 6 weeks or longer, and then extrapolating that, if you will, for what would that year look like. Take that to the next level at the bottom of this slide, and you see it goes from the pilot vendors to all RSI vendors that RSI works with today, and then also extending it to top 25, 50, and 100 of the retailers' top vendors to look at, say, if these same benefits apply, and of course it's a fairly broad stroke, but if these benefits apply across all these vendors, what could this program be worth to us? With that said, I'll pass it back to Jennifer to talk a little bit more.
Great. Thanks, Martuza. I think that helps give some good perspective of what we actually mean when we talk about tactical use cases. So just in conclusion, there are a few things that I'll leave you with that as a retailer you probably should be asking. One is, do we have collaborative business processes? And if we do, are they standardized in a way that it's optimizing your team's labor? Then what happens for the supplier? What do they actually do? Is it clearly defined? And are there guardrails that are set that the supplier knows exactly what to do within what parameters, and your team knows what to do when those insights are brought to them? Which leads to the next question. Are you as an organization really receptive to insights? And if you are your category and merchandising and supply chain teams all operating from the same goal? I often see from retailers that different departments are having suppliers act in different ways, and many times they're conflicting. So that alignment is important. And then to what Martuza just covered, are we measuring the impact of sharing data? Can we produce an ROI from that? Both for yourselves as a retailer, but also for the supplier community as well. And then last but not least, it all ties down to deriving top and bottom line improvement. The Wall Street community, the board, the shareholders are all asking us as retailers to provide more and more value. And that's becoming increasingly difficult because the channels have blurred. Online sales are picking up tremendously. And it puts more and more pressure on us as retailers to perform and be able to find those incremental gains. And to get those gains, you really are going to need to leverage the resources that you have. And since most retailers don't have an availability to add more headcount, to do more analysis, to produce more insights, leveraging collaboration is another means to get that accomplished. It also gives you an environment that suppliers are going to spend more time and energy on your business. And the bottom line is, the more IQ points, the more focused on your business, the better. So Julie, I think that wraps up our perspective on use cases. I think we had some questions and answers.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer and Martuza and Jason. We're now ready to begin the panel discussion part of our webinar. And it looks like the first question is for Jason. Despite the advances in technology and data sharing, why are retailers still struggling to derive value from data and data sharing?
Thanks for the question. First, I don't think they've given enough time and attention or strategic priority and go down the path of first uncovering the data, what's most important, sharing that data with kind of top suppliers or top-tier business partners. But sometimes I see companies measure the most important or fundamental metrics differently, or they will either have a different formula or they'll call it something different. So to be on the same page, and by the way, there's just mounds of data, and it's increasing at such an exponential rate. I heard the other day, and I thought this was fascinating, that there's more data accumulated in just 2 days than there was kind of world to date all the way up to 2003. So that can be overwhelming for retailers. It can be overwhelming for suppliers. There's so much data and what to do with it, and also often the data reports that are printed out or shared either internally or externally with suppliers. Sometimes it's just telling you where things are broken, and so it's rear view looking and doesn't give a whole lot of insight into what has happened or why things have happened, or more importantly, what to do about it. And so the how is just as important as the what in our view, and to be able to do that in a seamless fashion, especially under a standardized system, I think would be most important. But again, because sometimes the technology arm is a separate wing of an entire enterprise, whether it be a retailer or supplier, to kind of bring that and commingle that, particularly as everything is transitioning into much more of a digital arena for the consumer. That'll be important to marry all of those strategically, financially, and then systematically to be able to execute upon that strategy.
Okay, and then where do you see immediate short and long-term opportunities existing?
A good question. I can maybe address the front end of that, and maybe Jennifer can provide more of the medium or long-term as far as maybe where this goes, but be able to create some sort of collaborative opportunities and even systems and processes. But like we talked about on this call, like to identify what is most critical, what is most important, what are those top-tier goals, and what does it take to get there, and really just starting with your top suppliers, your top constituents, and some of that is even sourced by those that are telling you where to go, whether it be the board or your investment community, to say, hey, here's what's most important, like we talked about. These are the most critical financial drivers. But then to take that and translate that, and even in a simplified manner, to be able to attack it with the right technology systems and partners, to be able to have the right version of the truth, one version of the truth, and then be able to expand that collaboratively with suppliers, to be able to have the right training mechanisms, and then to really make that tangible, not just theoretical, but be able to make that tangible, both and be able to measure it and watch it, and then be able to have a decent amount of ROI where it's not just terminology and buzzwords and acronyms, but that there's a real follow-through with both the, like I said before, with both the quantitative and the qualitative, so it's hitting all those goals and all the targets that you're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just follow up on that, Jason. I think the longer term opportunities also exist around, it's sometimes much easier to share and to collaborate with your closest business partners. But when you're able to extend collaboration to beyond your top 4 or 5 partners and really get into probably your top 20, 30, or even 100 suppliers, and that looks different based on each supplier's size, but it gives you an even broader opportunity to really derive benefit. And so I think that's the long-term capability that a retailer should be striving for.
Okay, and then Jennifer, maybe you can take this next question. How do I ensure my suppliers are focused on the right problems and key areas to help me reach my goals?
Sure, and I can give some examples from several retailers that I've worked with, but different retailers have attacked it from different means. But I would say universally the first step, again, is to select the right use cases you want them to focus on and that you've got collaborative business processes set up around those. But many retailers will incorporate data collaboration as an agenda item for all of their supplier meetings. So there's a level of expectation. What did you look at? What did you measure? Are you bringing it to us in the form that we need it? And it becomes a very productive means of working with the data. I've also seen it incorporated into quarterly category reviews internally within the retailer. If you think about as a category manager or a merchant, they're responsible for a group of products or categories within the store. And if they are collaborating with their suppliers and reporting back on that in their category reviews and producing results for the executives within the organization, that creates a means for accountability. Then we also see, again, I've mentioned it once or twice, but we also see it being incorporated at high-level strategic top-to-top and joint business planning meetings where it's very clear, here's where we're performing, here's where we have opportunity, and then this is the plan that we're going to use to go after those opportunities. And I would say last but not least, there's at least one retailer that we're working with that has created retailer collaboration coordinators who are actually responsible for collaboration with specific groups of suppliers. And their role is to make sure that the supplier is doing the analysis, that the retailer is accepting the insights in a reasonable way, that hurdles are knocked down, and that that value is being documented. So when you put somebody responsible in charge of that, again, it creates a level of accountability, and somebody's driving the process, which is always helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and here's another question for you, Jennifer. I share my daily sales data but don't see much return. What else can or should I be sharing?
That's a good question. So if you're developing templatized use cases with protocols around what to do with those use cases, what we've done is created lists of metrics and attributes that are really key for successful data sharing. And those metrics are cataloged by what use cases they support, and we've prioritized them from 1 being critical to 2 being good to have, and 3 as best in class. So evaluating how your associates are working with suppliers on collaboration, what tools they're using, and what you need to make it work are really quite key. I'll give you some examples. So must-have data includes master data, sales, and inventory. So that's pretty basic and what a lot of folks are sharing right now. Good to haves would be things like store orders, store receipts, DC orders. And then best in class, we've talked a little bit about, but things like promotional calendars, restatement of data. So at the end of an accounting period, for example, when things change and data gets restated, making sure we're incorporating that back through data sharing as well. And then others like forecasting and in-stock percentages.
Okay. And then the next question is, where do suppliers go if they have questions or run into challenges? Do you want to take that one, Murtuza?
Absolutely. I think support and training is critical to make any of this work. Where a retailer has selected a technology provider such as RSI, usually the provider will provide some level of support, and I think you can break it up into 2 aspects: is the tactical support and then the strategic support. On the tactical side, for things like questions around what does this metric mean, how do I make sense of this data, or how do I create a meaningful report, take an existing report and modify it, or even as simple as I lost my password. That's typically managed through a support team. And then on a strategic level, there's also questions around how do I build a collaborative business process? How do I take this one step further? When Retail Solutions works with retailers and they have a partnership, we put in place channel managers, and these people understand the retailer, how they do business, to speak the language, and they're responsible to take that support to the next level of actually creating these collaborative business processes and providing value back to the vendor community. So this can mean a substantial amount of labor, and if the retailer is not leveraging a solution provider like RSI, they will have to plan on supporting these questions and the services to support the vendor community to help them be effective.
Hey, this is Jay. I actually wanted to add something that Murtuza just said that I would echo tremendously. It's spend time learning your retailer's language, not just learning the strategic objectives, but what's most important to them, what's working, what's not working, where do they over-index, where do they under-index. These things, the more you can understand about your retail customer, and the more you understand where they're going, where they're trying to get, and then you can then translate that all the way through down to the buyer level and even down to the store level. And when you find disconnects or when things are not aligned with how the senior management team has set the course, it's in your right, I think, to call that out and say, hey, that's actually a little bit counter to how the company set the objective. I've been spending my time studying this company, and things are different from how it's shaking out, either with that use case or whatever the item may be. I couldn't underscore that more in terms of knowing your customers and knowing to the point where you have both the qualitative and quantitative targets and plans, whether they be jointly owned or just straight up from the retailer, what they're trying to accomplish, and understanding that so you can apply it back to your business.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the next question is, how do I ensure all internal stakeholders understand, properly support, and or participate in collaborative business processes? Jennifer, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Several retailers that I work with have established advisory boards, and those advisory boards meet a couple of times a year and are usually comprised of pretty senior leadership in the category, merchandising, supply chain, and operations areas. And that group is really intended to provide guidance to the program. And usually they invite a number of suppliers to actually come and sit on that board with them. And, to Jason's point just a minute ago, what these advisory boards do are provide a venue for the supplier to come back and say, hey, guys, you're asking us to do two different things in two different areas, and this doesn't work. Here's where we see some opportunity. And given that the board is at a typically higher level, that allows for solution solving, I would say, solution creation for those types of issues. And I think, too, having a cross-functional group helps ensure, that those barriers are more easily broken down, and also gives the supplier a safe place to come and actually talk to the retailer in a very functional way so that they can understand, why things are or are not going very well.
Okay, and there's another question for you here, Jennifer. Are there different ways to do data sharing? What are my options?
Sure. So I think, there are two ways. One is with structure, where use cases are defined and expectations are set with the supplier community. And then there's without structure, which frankly isn't very strategic, but it's what most retailers are doing right now. And I think also tactically there are various ways to share data too. The least efficient and prone to error is disseminating data through portals. Usually the retailer systems aren't able to keep up with that over time. I was blown away by the statistic Jason just mentioned about the volume of data growth since 2003, and I think that's indicative of what we're seeing in portals. They just can't keep up. There's also an opportunity for EDI feeds, and those have been deployed for many years, but they aren't an effective means of transferring some of these more advanced forms of data, like promotional calendars and forward-looking forecasts and such. And if you've got van fees associated, that can be problematic as well for the supplier. So we see the best alternative is flat files being transferred either to the supplier or a third-party provider via secure lines, so that you can incorporate all the data that you need and also meet your security protocols.
Okay, great. Martuza, what if I don't have store inventory data, only POS? Is it still worth sharing?
It's a great question. I think it's not ideal, but again, some data is better than no data. So if you think about what can you do with just POS store sales, there are some simple use cases, but very effective ones. And give you some examples would be, basic shelf outs. So if you haven't seen sales in a statistically significant time period, is there a problem, and what actions can we take? New items speed to shelf. One of the key questions that vendors have is, well, great. I'd spent a lot of time and money getting my product out to the stores. Now, how do I track, and what are the steps that I can take to, optimize or improve my speed to shelf? Assortment plannings, pricing information can be then also got from just POS data. I think one of the key things to also consider is not just the metrics, but also the granularity of the data. And if it goes down to daily data, just having that real-time visibility into what's going on can also help a lot of these use cases, and also help make decisions that help drive the business forward for both the retailer and the vendor partners.
Okay. And then the next question is for Jason. Why not sell suppliers the data versus sharing it with them?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this. In fact, there's also a question in the queue in terms of how much data should be shared, either from the retailer at the kind of the full store or the full category, just on specific areas. And this all kind of blends together as I look at it, because certainly there's been this inherent lack of trust historically around retailers thinking that the suppliers are going to hijack or try to use their data selfishly rather than actually trying to grow the category where everybody wins. And so that has been part of the initial hesitation to either share it for free, or when I see some retailers charge for data, and there's plenty of examples like that, then all of a sudden participation goes down, or the usage or utilization is compromised, or then it's really only the biggest guys get to play into that, and they're the only ones that have budgets for it. But I've also seen on the other side, if it is free, that retailers kind of build the system and they just hand off the keys to suppliers, say, hey, you go drive this and have fun, tell us what you learn, and that doesn't work either. They just say, go fish. And give us your best ideas and best practices, and you put the labor behind it. So on both extremes, I don't see that working very well to where it can be optimized somewhere in the middle, where even if there is some kind of pay-to-play opportunity, something like dunnhumby with Kroger is a good example, where that's expensive. That's not cheap stuff, but there's real value creation in being a part of that, and it is a bit of a third-party opportunity to fill in those gaps. We see some real, much more tangible not just relevant data, but real tangible opportunities to grow together, or for suppliers to leverage that kind of data, especially if it's a third-party data, into some other opportunities, even within the Amazon umbrella of capturing real insights around their vendor central, to where you can layer in some investments into Amazon Media Group or other things that can influence offline sales or offline opportunities to really make an impression. And that can be leveraged across multiple areas, multiple channels. That's not that retailers want to see that happen, but I think there's an opportunity to really come together to grow an entire category and do it in a way that is much more collaborative, or fill those gaps like Jennifer talked about. And there's plenty of those gaps out there that should be glaring if you have the right systems to create those alerts.
Okay. And we have another question here. How do I need to organize for running a program? What level of effort is required? Resources and organizational roles? What department normally is responsible for running it? Murtuza, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. I think it's what we've seen. Usually the collaboration programs are sponsored out of supply chain or category merchandising. But the most successful ones, in terms of how they implemented and run, and the return on investment that's been created for the retailers and the vendor partners, typically include executive level support and oversight, and also buy-in from the three key departments. And if you think about these three key departments of operations, supply chain, and category, these align really closely with everything we've talked about in terms of how collaborative programs are designed, from a designing on which use cases or business problems we're trying to solve, how do we solve them collaboratively, and how do we take action. So these three key pillars are then related to each of these departments, which drive the best results. And oftentimes these three areas are not in close alignment, which is something that obviously the best-in-class programs have fixed the problem, and that's when they've seen the maximum scaling of programs like this. And I'd say lastly, the collaboration within your organization and with your suppliers. Suppliers have a lot to bring to the table. They understand their business well. They understand your business, and they're usually eager to help solve business problems and help grow the business, mutually. And that is definitely the best in class way to go to market. Jennifer mentioned retailer collaboration coordinators. I think when those are put in place, that really makes sure that the program's well aligned. It runs like a well-oiled machine. Everybody's focused on the right things and the right objectives that the retailer wants to achieve.
Okay, and it looks like we have time for one last question. This one's for Jason. How do I properly measure the success of my vendor collaboration program or identify what's working and what needs improvement?
Sure. What's working, what's winning is important for everybody to identify, and even to define the win. What would that look like as what we're trying to all accomplish? I'd say a couple things that come to mind. One, you want to make sure that as you measure data and measure the effectiveness of some of your programs, to make sure you do it in a consistent and a timely basis. So have a monthly time series, a quarterly time series, and even an annual review to assess what was the objective met, and be able to determine a better path to ROI. And in the same mindset as you create some scorecards for suppliers and grading them and measuring them and telling them where they rank, how well they do versus their peer set, whether it's within the category or across the entire box, to fill in those gaps like we talked about previously. But we'd also be able to do some trend analysis and some time series. We're a big believer in time series to be able to catch inflections and to catch them early. What's changed versus trend, what's changed versus plan are very important to be able to identify on both sides of the coin with retailers and suppliers. And then lastly, like I said, when you look for the definition of the win and being able to document those wins and even celebrating those wins, be able to track those on an ongoing basis and doing that across the entire organization and on both the retail front and suppliers, and making sure everybody understands in a simplistic way what is working, what doesn't work, and then have some action items to that, not just to say, here's the information to have a nice day, but then to deploy it in a way that empowers both your own teams from a retail standpoint, especially from the execution and the operations side of things, but also from suppliers to be able to help get things done rather than even just doing it yourself or asking them to fix it. That doesn't work necessarily either. So those are my concluding thoughts on that last question.
Okay, well, thank you to our speakers, Jason, Jennifer, and Murtuza, and to our audience members for taking time out of your busy days to join us. We hope that you will join us for our next webinar, Measuring Performance, the Key to Connecting the Collaboration Dots. In the first two webinars, you learned about daily data sharing and actionable intelligence. We've discussed how to properly utilize alerts to improve in-store operations and on-shelf availability. Session 3 taught us how to create and execute against collaborative business processes with suppliers to overcome key challenges and meet your organizational goals. Now, in this fourth and final webinar, we bring it all together with a look at how to effectively scorecard your categories and suppliers, as well as incorporate that work into your joint business planning processes, the ultimate in collaboration and a new operational imperative. Moderated by Supermarket News, this Best Practices series offers attendees practical advice to put into action immediately. The next webinar is scheduled for November 6th at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 2 p.m. Eastern. Registering is easy by visiting the RSI Collaboration Forum at www.retailercollaboration.com. If you don't have an account, simply create one for easy access. If you've missed any webinars in this series, you can watch them now in the Collaboration Forum. We appreciate the time you took out of your day to attend today's session and look forward to your feedback, which you can email in or send us via the Q&A box. We will send a copy of this presentation along with the Q&A out to all attendees. The Best Practice webinar series will continue to be hosted on RSI's online retail collaboration forum. Visit www.retailercollaboration.com and register for upcoming webinars in the media room. Remember to check back often as new webinars and collaborative resources are added all the time. Thank you again for joining today's program and have a great rest of your day.